Hello everyone, it's Crystal. Welcome back to the Library Quilt Along. We are now in part 6 of the Quilt Along. In this video, we will discuss binding. I will show you how to calculate binding so that you can cover your entire quilt. I will show you how to attach your binding strips so that you can have one long continuous binding strip. And then I will show you how to attach your binding to your quilt sandwich. Our quilt is quilted. We have a top, we have batting, and we have backing. Our entire sandwich has been quilted, and now we're ready to attach the binding. So let's get started. We need to do some math to calculate how much binding we need for our quilt. As an example, my quilt is 60 inches wide and 84 inches long. And to calculate the perimeter that we need to go around the entire quilt, it will be the length plus the width times 2. So both lengths, both widths times, that will give you the perimeter. So this is 144 times 2. And so my perimeter equals 288 inches. I like to add somewhere between 10 to 12 inches just to be safe. So my extra is going to be 12 inches so I can have a nice even 300 inches of binding strip. And I'm using cotton fabric, and just to be, it's usually 42 to 44 inches long, selvage to selvage, but I just say 40 inches for my strip. That would be my strip length. So when I do the math, I get 7.5 strips, but I always round up. So I need 8 strips of 2.5 inch wide batting, 2.5 inch wide fabric for my quilt binding. So once again, you have to measure your quilt, take the width and the length, and the perimeter equals the distance around all of the sides. So I took my width plus my length, multiplied it by 2. So this is 144 times 2, 288 inches. And I added some extra, 12 inches. That gives me 300 inches of binding I need to cover my quilt and be safe. My strips will be 40 inches long, give or take. Did the math, so that's 7.5 strips. You round up to the next whole number. So I need 8 strips. My binding will be 2.5 inches wide. And once I cut the binding strips, I will show you how to attach them to make one long binding strip. I have cut all 8 of my binding strips. They are 2.5 inches wide. Now I'm going to join the binding strips so that I can have one long strip. So after I cut my strip 2.5 inches, I went to the ironing board and I pressed it in half. So the wrong sides are together, and I pressed it in half. I left the selvage on because I'm going to cut it off once I join my strips. You have 2 options for joining your strips. You can join them like I showed you when I joined the strips for my shelves. You can join them with a straight seam like this. But the way I'm going to show you, your seam will be more stable. So we're going to join them on an angle. So the first piece will go horizontally. The end of the strip is over here on the right. Then I take my next strip, and you don't have to iron them in half. I just get better results when I iron them in half. So you can try it both ways and do whatever works best for you. So we take our second strip and we lay it pretty sized together, perpendicular to the first strip. So the first strip is out to the left, and then the second strip is on top, pretty side facing the bottom strip, and is perpendicular. Then we turn our strip 45 degrees this way. And so we're going to sew from this point here down to this point. I have diagonal seam tape on the table of my sewing machines to make sure I have a straight seam. So once again, the bottom strip is face up. The end of the strip is here on the right. The top strip is face down, perpendicular to the bottom strip. Pretty sides are facing each other. Then we turn clockwise 45 degrees, and then we place we're going to sew a diagonal seam from here to here. If you think about it this way, if you have a United States map from Washington to Florida, northwest to southeast, upper left to bottom right, however you need to think about it. So upper left to bottom right, Washington to Florida, northwest to southeast, however it makes you remember. Then we turn, lower my presser foot, lower my needle, and I'm going to look at this red line because this red line represents my needle. As long as my point is on the red line, then I know that my seam will be straight. So my stitch length is 2.0. So I stop, and if you're a beginner, I suggest you cut your thread there. But I'm going to do chain piecing. So I'm taking the end of the strip that was on top. Now that's going to be on the bottom. Same thing. This strip, the end of this strip is to the right. I take my third strip. I place it perpendicular. I open it up, place it perpendicular to the strip that's on the bottom. I'm going to sew upper left to bottom right, so I need to turn 45 degrees. Lift my presser foot, place my fabric, lower my presser foot, and once again I'm still looking at this red line, and I will sew. So I'm going to do that for all of my strips, and then but I'm going to stop right here, cut my thread, lift my presser foot, and then I will have these strips together. So I take my scissors, and then I just clip them apart, and this is what's left for each strip. This is going to be cut off. You can use a ruler and a rotary cutter, but I just use scissors. These are fabric scissors. I just cut here, and I cut about 1/4 inch or so away from the stitching line, and I cut across here. And so when I take it to the ironing board, I'm just going to press this open, Press this seam open, and then I'm going to press it in half again. That's one of the benefits of pressing in half first, so you know exactly where half should be. So once again, going to go to the ironing board, press this seam open so to reduce the bulk, and then I'm going to press this close. So when I'm done, I will have 8 strips together as one long strip. And that's another reason when we calculated the binding, I said to add the extra, because you're going to join it like this. And we need to take into account our mitered corners. So if you have any questions, let me know. Next thing we will do is attach the binding to the quilt. When I add my binding to my quilt, I usually start at the bottom. And I say usually because sometimes if I have binding that has multiple colors and I want the colors to be placed a certain way, I'll start at whatever side will give me the placement that I need. So this is the bottom of my library quilt, and this is my binding. I'm going to keep a tail of about 12 inches or so. I usually, and just to keep that hanging so that when it's time to join the quilt, we'll have plenty of fabric to join. So I'll start towards the middle, and this is the fold right here. These are the raw edges. So I line up the raw edges of the binding with the raw edge of the quilt. And this is the front of the quilt. So I'm going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I have changed my presser foot. This is my walking foot. The way my sewing machine comes, this is a motorized walking foot. This black right here, this has feed dogs. So I have a feed dogs on my walking foot, and I also have the feed dogs on my sewing machine. So they work together so that I can easily feed. I had 2 layers of fabric and a layer of batting for my quilt, and I have 2 layers of fabric for my binding. So that's a lot of fabric to try to feed through the machine. And I use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. These red lines, these are 1/8 inch. So the second line is a 1/4 inch. And my stitch length is 2.5. So I sew slowly just so I don't have any issues. I lower my presser foot, lower my needle, and I just lock these stitches first. When I get close to the corner, I'm going to stop. I'm going to mark 1/4 inch away from the corner. And as I get close to that line, I'm going to stop and shorten my stitch length so that I can get on that line exactly. So, but right now we're just going to stitch, line up the binding with the edge of the quilt and just stitch. And my quilt is 60 by 84 or so. It's hard to measure because I don't have a table big enough. I have a 6-foot table, so I can measure the width pretty good, but it's difficult to measure the length. So now the corner is in the frame. Let me just do a few more stitches. And when I stop my machine, it always stops with the needle down, so that's always helpful. So this is a friction pin. When you can mark on your fabric, Should always test your fabric, but when I mark on my fabric, this will disappear with heat. Some people say it comes back with the cold, but this will be in the binding, so if it does come back, no one will see it. So I take my ruler, and this yellow line is a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to line up this yellow 1/4 inch line with the edge of my quilt here, and I'm going to just mark a 1/4 inch. That's where I'm going to stop when I get close to the corner. And the brown fabric, it's hard to see, but I'll be looking over here, lining up this line with my needle. So I do that for all 4 corners. And these gloves have rubber tips, and that helps me to grip my quilt. So I'm getting close to that line. So I go to my sewing machine and I shorten my stitch length to 1.6 millimeters. That looks about right. I just lock those stitches and then I cut my thread. I lift my presser foot and it is very close. Slightly over, but I can just pull that back. So here's my quilt, my corner. I'm going to take my binding and place it to the right. See this fold here? This should be a 45-degree angle. This fold should line up with this corner. So I just do a finger press, then I take the binding and I fold it back towards the left. There will be a fold on this side as well. This fold should be flush with this side of the quilt. And then I just do a finger press, hold this corner with my right hand, and then I turn my quilt with my left hand. Just make sure this stays straight. I place my quilt back under the presser foot. Make sure we have enough binding. This is my first time using this binding baby, so this is interesting. So I have my 2 folds. I have my 45-degree fold, and then I have my fold at the top here. Now it's at the top since we turned. I'll place my quilt underneath. I don't put it directly on the edge. You need to, okay, 1/4 inch here, and then I will lower my presser foot, lower my needle. I always lock my stitches, and then I go backwards till I'm off of the quilt. Because this side you need to start at the back, but if you start at the back, then you'll have a problem getting on the quilt. I've locked those stitches, so I put it on the quilt, go backwards, then come forward. So I stop, and then I'll increase my stitch length back up to 2.5 until I get to the next corner. And I will do that for the remaining 3 corners. When I get to the top of my quilt, my sleeve is attached. So I'm going to actually increase my stitch length when I get to the top of my quilt, because that's another 2 layers of fabric. So I will see you back here when I get to the top of my quilt. So I'm close to the top of my quilt, and I just wanted to show you how to miter the corner one more time. So I've already marked a 1/4 inch line, and I'm going to stitch the binding down until I get close to that orange line. So I'm going to lower my stitch length to 1.6 millimeters and just inch my way towards the line. And that looks like it's straight. I can always check with my ruler, see if the line lines up with my presser foot, with my needle, and that looks straight. So I lock my stitches, cut my thread, and raise my presser foot. And it's actually on the line exactly. So I take my binding, fold it towards the right, making sure I have a 45-degree angle. This fold is in the corner, and I just finger press to make sure it stays that way. And then I will fold the binding towards the left, and this fold is flush with this edge of the binding. And I finger press that. So I hold the binding and the quilt with my right hand. I will turn my quilt with my left hand. And I will place my quilt back under my presser foot, line it up with that second line, that's 1/4 inch. Lower my presser foot, lower my needle, lock the stitches, and go backwards off the quilt. Then I come forward, and then I stop. These clips are holding my sleeve. Here's my sleeve right here. So I'm going to increase my stitch length to 3.0 because I'm going through another 2 layers of fabric. So I'm going to finish the top of the quilt, and I have 2 more corners, and I will meet you back here and show you how to join the end of the quilt, the end with the beginning. We are now back at the bottom of the quilt. So I have approximately probably 18 inches. I'm going to just sew a little bit more. So I'm going to stop here, lock my threads, cut my thread, and I'll show you how to join the quilt. So the key is to put your quilt into your lap, so that the edge where you're going to meet to join is in front of you. I had several problems in the beginning when I was quilting. The key is to put the quilt in your lap. I don't know if it's because I'm left-handed. I had some issues. So this is all left, my extra binding. So the formula is I'm going to join them diagonally. You could always join them with a straight seam, but the rest of my seams for my binding are diagonally. So I'm going to just make sure that this is diagonal as well. Just cut this piece off here. So the formula for joining binding, if you're going to do a diagonal binding and you need this to be overlapped, this piece on the left needs to overlap with this piece on the right. And the formula is the width of your binding strip plus 1/4 inch. So my binding strip, if you recall, is 2.5 inches. So I need to overlay, I need my overlap to be 2 3/4 inches. So I'm going to just make sure, like, see, I have a seam here. So I have to make sure I take that into account. I don't want two seams that close together. So I'm going to cut this a little bit more, the bottom seam, the one on the right. And I'm going to measure 2 3/4 inches from this edge, so that I can mark it on this brown the strip on the right. So 2 3/4. I usually do just a smidgen more, just in case I'm off, because this binding is not biased, so it's not going to stretch a whole lot. So I usually just, instead of being flush to this edge, I just cut over just a smidgen. And so 2 3/4. This is 2, this is 3/4. And that line is 2 3/4. So now I know I can lay the left strip on top of the right strip, and then I can cut there. And I can cut this, and now I can join them. I showed you previously how to join the strips. This is the strip. The strip on the left goes out to the left. This strip here on the right is perpendicular, pretty sized together. And we are going to turn this intersection. We're going from Washington to Florida. I'm going to lower my stitch length to 1.6. So we're joining them just like we joined our binding strips. We're going from that corner to this corner. Lower my needle and sew straight. I'm going to watch this red line, the corner in the red line, to make sure my seam is straight. Cut my thread, lift my presser foot, and when I do like this, it's perfect. I just need to cut this off. Then I'm going to take this seam to the ironing board. I'm going to press this seam open, and I'm going to continue sewing this seam, continue sewing this binding, and then it'll be done. Part 1 will be done. So we got our perfect join here. I'm going to take this to the ironing board, and I'm going to press this open, then press this, and then I'm going to close this right here. I'm going to sew this shut. Then I'm going to go back to the ironing board. I'm going to press my binding up and over, and then I'll be back for part 2. Before we stitch the binding down permanently, I just want to reiterate what I just did. I took the quilt to the ironing board, and I ironed from the front. I ironed it up like this, and then I turned the quilt over to the back, and I folded the binding over, and I ironed from this way also. So I do from the front all the way around, turn it over, and do it from the turn the binding over and iron from the back side up. I just wanted to show you the corner. This is the front. This is the bottom right corner from the front. And then from the back, we're about to stitch this down. See, this is still up. So I stitch from the front and I stitch in the ditch, which means this seam right here where the fold is, this is where I stitch. I stitch slowly, so this part usually takes longer than the first part because I want to make sure that I'm stitching in the ditch and you cannot see the stitches. So I usually start in the corner, and I usually manually lower my needle just to make sure I have it where I want it. All right, that looks like it's good. Lower my presser foot, lock my stitches, and then I stitch around the quilt. I'll just show you a few stitches. I'm lining up this seam, stitching in the ditch. So that's how I do it. That's how slow I stitch around. Once I'm done with stitching in the ditch, I will show you how it looks. So I did my stitching in the ditch all the way around, and I just wanted to show you what the back of this is the front of the quilt. And I did stitching in the ditch. It was more challenging for this part. This is the bottom of the quilt because the binding and the bottom shelf are the same color, and it's a dark color, so it was more challenging to get the stitch into the ditch. But since my thread is the same color as the thread I use for quilting the quilt, it doesn't look as bad, and nobody really will be looking that closely. And this is what the back of the quilt looks like. I caught all of the edges. If you don't like how that looks, you can always do part 2 by hand. As you know, I don't sew by hand, but I did catch all of the binding on the back. I missed a small spot. It didn't matter, but I did go back and fix it. It's about 3 stitches worth that I went back and I made sure I got all of the binding, because that would be the piece that catches onto something, right? So I just wanted to make sure that I have all of my binding stitched down all the way around. So this is the end of the Library Quilt Quilt-Along. Remember to share your progress on Instagram and use the hashtag Library Quilt QAL. Once again, the hashtag is Library Quilt QAL. After the quilt-along is over, if you have questions about making this quilt or any other quilting questions you may have, any issues you may come into contact with, feel free to contact me. My information is at the end of this video, and thank you for joining me on this quilt-along. Happy sewing, happy quilting.